can remember it was 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday, and the light bulb went off in my head, and I said, I bet that we could somehow use ultrasound to treat these patients with otherwise untreatable tumors. As long as I've had memories, all I ever wanted to do was neurosurgery.
Welcome to Curing with Sound, a podcast from the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. I'm your host, Allison Preston Smith. We're honored to sit down with Dr. Neal Kassell, founder and chairman of the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. With a distinguished career as the former co-chair of neurosurgery at the University of Virginia, Dr. Kassell brings a wealth of expertise, having authored over 500 scientific papers and book chapters. He has secured over $30 million in funding from the National Institute of Health and through industry grants and contracts. As a respected member of the medical societies both in the United States and abroad, Dr. Kassell has played pivotal roles on ad hoc committees of the National Institute of Health and as an editor for various academic journals. Notably, he was named to the Blue Ribbon panel of then Vice President Joe Biden's Cancer Moonshot Task Force in 2016. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Kassell.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So was there a moment when you were a kid that sparked your interest in the medical field or in becoming a neurosurgeon?
As long as I've had memories, all I ever wanted to do was neurosurgery, at least from the age of 10.
And if you hadn't become a neurosurgeon, what would you have done?
Neurosurgery.
You were laser focused on wanting to pursue that.
That's all I ever wanted to do.
And you started pretty young in high school, right?
Yeah, I was working in a neurosurgery research laboratory when I was 16, and I also had the opportunity to assist in the operating room, things that you couldn't do today. But that was when I first had my patient experience.
And I think one of the most interesting things I've learned about you is that you just went right into research and were able to bypass high school, right?
Well, when I was in high school, at the end of the day, I used to go to the laboratory and we would start experiments at 3 in the afternoon that would go through the night until 2 or 3 in the morning. And then after a while, that sort of stopped and I stopped going to school, went to work in the laboratory or help in the operating room.
Were you at a local university's laboratory or somewhere else?
It was at Pennsylvania Hospital.
And how did you end up in the lab and how did you end up in this clinical setting?
Well, when I was in high school, every summer I used to go to a camp in the Poconos. And there was one summer when I failed calculus and I was supposed to go to summer school. But at the last minute, they told me I couldn't go to summer school because I failed with an F instead of an E. And you were then required to repeat the course during the school year, not during summer school. So I had nothing to do that summer. My former camp counselor, Jimmy Weinstein, was a medical student at Penn, and I had stayed in touch with him. He wasn't going back. He was working in a laboratory at the South Jersey Medical Research Foundation in Camden. And he said, why don't you come help in the laboratory? It's a neurosurgical laboratory. I said, that's great. So I did that. And then the laboratory that summer, the end of the summer, moved from South Jersey to Pennsylvania Hospital. And I was the only person around to help make that move. And so I continued on doing the research.
And what kind of research were you doing?
We were doing research on intracranial pressure and the cerebral circulation.
So do you think he recognized something in you or recognized that passion to work in the medical field and just tried to get you, fully immersed in that field?
No, I already had the passion, and this was just like a phenomenal opportunity at a relatively young age to be able to exercise that passion.
So what was the transition from high school to college then?
In high school, at that time, we were on the AB system, and half the class graduated in December and half the class graduated in, May. And I was not able to graduate from high school because I hadn't been there enough. You had to be there more than 45 out of 90 days. So then I had a period of time from December till the following September when college started to work full-time in the laboratory.
Mm-hmm. And did you have to do anything to be eligible for college, or what was that next stage that got you more into formal medical school?
I had applied to I'd only applied to one college, which was Haverford. And I was accepted, and then I had a subsequent interview, and they asked me how I was going to pay for school. And I said, I'm going to pay for myself. And they said, well, that's good. And they said, what type of work do you do? What do you get paid for? I said, I get paid to do medical research. I work in a research laboratory. And they said, who funds your laboratory? And I said, the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. Well, this was the height of Vietnam, and Haverford was a Quaker school populated by pacifists. And so this was in the summer. And then they invited me for another interview, and they suggested that I would be more comfortable in a different environment if I was going to continue to work for the Army Chemical Corps. So I had to scurry around and somehow get accepted to Penn instead of sort of a very late exceptional admission.
And how did you get that admission? Did you have to do any additional courses or get letters of recommendation?
Letters of recommendation, and I had published some papers and things like that.
And then were there any important lessons or challenges you learned while navigating medical school and research and working at that time?
Well, it was a busy time because when I was in college, I was married and I had a couple of kids, and then I was running a large research laboratory at the time, and I'd started a computer company. So between the company, the lab, my family, and school, I was fully occupied.
Yeah, that's a lot to balance. Was there anything you did to make that work?
Didn't sleep.
I was going to say, that it sounds like you were running on nearly 24 hours a day.
Had a good wife.
And then from there, what was your first job out of medical school? Then
I interned at Pennsylvania Hospital, and then I did the first half of my residency at Penn, and then the second 2 years at the University of Western Ontario with Dr. Drake, who was at the time the world's leading neurosurgeon.
Wow, that's incredible. Was there anything you learned from him or any particular lessons that he taught you?
The reason I wanted to work with Dr. Drake was because he was a specialist in intracranial aneurysms, which I had a strong interest in. And I applied and he accepted me, but it was a 2-year, I needed 2 years there, but he would only accept me for 1 year because he thought I couldn't cut it because I only had sight in one eye, right? So halfway through the first year, he said, okay, I was wrong. We'll keep you for 2 years.
Did you have to really prove yourself, or was there anything that you had to do?
No, it was a strange thing because at the time the operating microscope had just been introduced, and it was sort of people were having difficulty accommodating to it. And Dr. Drake had been invited to give a lecture, and he sort of invited me to come along as his bag carrier and give a talk. And then he introduced me. He said that the reason that I was so exceptionally skillful using the operating microscope is because I only had one eye and I didn't have the difficulties accommodating that people who had binocular vision did. Anyhow, and I think that was all nonsense, but it worked out.
Right. Really turned it around. And I'm sure at that point, your work already was speaking for itself. So
I never graduated from college.
You didn't graduate from college?
I went to Penn for 4 years and 3 summers, and my cumulative average was 1.1 out of 4.
Wow.
And they told me if I wanted to graduate, I'd have to go for another 2.5 years at a minimum. And after my first semester, they had rewarded me with 3 semesters of academic probation and 5 semesters of disciplinary probation.
Oh, no.
So then the way I got accepted to medical school was I had published a lot of papers, and I had letters of recommendation from 3 neurosurgery programs that said in the unlikely event that I ever got accepted to medical school and completed medical school, that they would take me into their residency. So,
wow, that's incredible.
But I did graduate from medical school. And then the other sort of bizarre part of it was I did a combined 6-year MD PhD program. And I was able to do it in 4 years, despite the fact I had kids, the laboratory, computer company, and so on. And when it came time for me to start on my thesis, they said, we made a mistake. We can't despite the fact you've done all this work, we can't give you a PhD because Penn doesn't grant PhDs to people that don't have undergraduate degrees.
Oh, that's unfortunate. Was that double the course load then? Or?
It wasn't double, but it was a lot.
That's incredible. You were tasked with a very important job when you operated on then Senator Biden's aneurysms in the late 80s. He said the experience shaped him into the man that he wanted to be. So what was the experience like for you? Was it difficult doing this kind of surgery with a lot of pressure since he was such a public figure at the time?
Well, I didn't feel a lot of pressure because my practice at UVA consisted of a lot of sort of high-profile international type of patients. And, you know, to me, a patient was a patient. Mm-hmm. The only thing that was a little bit unusual was the second time that he had surgery. I was standing at the door of the operating room as they were wheeling him in on the gurney, and he grabbed me by the arm and looked at me with those steely gray eyes and said, Doc, do a good job because someday I'm going to be president.
Oh my gosh. I'm sure you were a close friend after that.
Yes. And then he would call me until he became president. He would call me every year on the anniversary of his surgery and on my birthday.
Throughout that time, like you said, he continued to maintain close contact. And decades later, you were asked by him to serve on the Blue Ribbon panel for his Cancer Moonshot initiative. Mm-hmm. So what went into that role?
I was the only non-cancer doctor on that Blue Ribbon panel. And I think I was basically his eyes and ears to help translate what happened amongst the experts to him.
Mm-hmm. Were you looking at emerging research, or what was your contribution?
The Cancer Moonshot dealt with everything from access to prevention to testing to treatment. And I didn't have a lot to contribute because I'm not a cancer doctor, but I certainly learned a lot and was able to help inform him.
It takes an incredible amount of education and skill and precision to be a successful neurosurgeon. So, and I'm sure the pressure is intense. Is there anything that was helpful for you to keep in mind, or anything you relied on when you're going into surgery?
No, just, the key thing was the ability to concentrate and almost enter into a Zen-like state that enabled you to focus on what you were doing, because it requires a lot of judgment, technical skill, courage to get these things done right.
Were there any patient stories that stand out to you that you still remember, or any complex cases?
The cases that I really remember were the failures. I don't really remember too much about the successes. And it's particularly the failures when things didn't work out and you had no idea why.
Right. I can imagine that would be incredibly frustrating. Yeah. Did you go back and would you, retrace what you did, or was there anything?
We'd look at the videos and talk to. We would sort of do an after action analysis with the residents. Try and figure out what went wrong.
Did that help you get any kind of resolution or any kind of closure, or, move on from that experience?
When we could identify mistakes, that was really helpful. But when we couldn't identify the root cause of the problem, it was very frustrating.
Right. And during the time when you were a neurosurgeon, were you still able to pursue research on the side as well?
Or how did you balance? I had a very large research laboratory.
And was there any particular area you focused on?
Yeah, on aneurysms and problems with blood vessels in the brain.
Was there any emerging research, or is that when you first learned about focused ultrasound?
About 20 years ago, I was searching for a solution to a fairly large number of patients I had who had brain tumors that were either in surgically difficult or inaccessible locations, or tumors that had maxed out on surgery and radiation and chemotherapy, and there was nothing left to offer these patients. So I was looking for a minimally invasive or non-invasive approach, and I really couldn't come up with one. And then in August, about 19 years ago, I was operating on a patient with a ruptured aneurysm, and a key member of the team, the neuroanesthesiologist, wasn't present. He was on vacation vacation, and they gave me a cardiac anesthesiologist who was very, very good. And he was talking to me, and he said, I've been doing this research where I've been measuring the blood flow in the heart muscle, the myocardium, using ultrasound and microbubbles and watching the clearance of the microbubbles using the ultrasound. He said, why don't you try that in the brain? It might be a good way to measure brain blood flow. So we started doing some experiments in that end of August, and it worked. So that was a bit of luck. And I remember I was driving home from the hospital. I can remember it was 4:30 in the afternoon on a Friday, and exactly the spot, and the light bulb went off in my head, and I said, I bet that we could somehow use ultrasound plus or minus these microbubbles to treat these patients with otherwise untreatable tumors. So I got really excited. I said, I've been doing research since 1962, and finally I have a Nobel Prize winning idea. So I raced home and went to the internet and discovered that focused ultrasound is a Nobel Prize winning idea. Just wasn't my idea.
Mm-hmm. What was it being used for at the time?
It was being used. There was an Israeli company, Insight Tech, that was starting to do some brain treatments and uterine fibroids, and some people were doing prostate, but basically that. And so I invited a number of people from the community to come hear about focused ultrasound. I invited people from Insight Tech and people from GE, that was an investor, a partner in Insight Tech, and the people of the community. We all got together and heard about focused ultrasound. I told them this was like getting a window into MR imaging at its beginning.
For those who may not be familiar, can you summarize what focused ultrasound technology is?
Focused ultrasound is a new, totally non-invasive therapeutic technology that can transform the treatment of a large number of serious medical disorders by serving as an alternative or as a complement to traditional surgery and radiation therapy, a whole new way of delivering drugs more safely and effectively, and of stimulating or enhancing the effectiveness of cancer immunotherapy, amongst other things. And as a result, it will result in a revolution in therapy of the same order of magnitude that MR scanning, for instance, resulted in a revolution in diagnosis.
And what year was it when you founded the Focused Ultrasound Foundation?
2006, October.
And how long did it take you to get the team fully together and get the foundation up and running?
It was a short period of time. It took a couple of months to get the core of the team. But then it grew much more rapidly than we ever imagined. I mean, the size and the complexity of the organization, and the impact that we had and the growth of the field far outstripped anything that any of us imagined.
How did you get other donors on board, and how did you convince other people that this was going to be a huge, groundbreaking technology? It
was just the story that I used to say that this is the most important advance in therapy since the invention of the scalpel. And that resonated with people. And we were lucky that we got some really great donors. We got some people on the board, and it sort of took off after that. Honey attracts bears. So. And
were there any key lessons you learned in those early days when everything was starting, and it sounds like things progressed very quickly, but was there anything that you can pinpoint that led to its success?
I think the success has been related to timing. The timing was right, to luck, and the luck and the timing are related. But most importantly, the people, right? And you've heard me say that we built the organization with the philosophy that A's attract A's and B's attract C's, and as a result, we keep the foundation populated by A players.
What areas of emerging research right now most excite you?
The two areas that I think are most important are the brain and cancer immunotherapy. Today, there are about 180 clinical indications in various stages of research and development and commercialization around the world. 10 years ago, there were only 3. So here at the foundation, we're interested ecumenically in all of those 180 indications, but where we tend to concentrate our resources and our thoughts, our mental energy, are on the brain, particularly neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, Huntington's disease, and OCD and depression and pain and epilepsy and cancer immunotherapy, with particular emphasis on really difficult to treat disorders like glioblastoma and pancreatic cancer.
And you've had an incredible career. Has there been a work philosophy that you followed throughout your career, or anything you try to keep in mind in the work you do?
Yeah, I mean, you wake up every morning with a commitment that you're going to do something to make the world a better place. That's what you wake up to. And so everything we do is all about the patients. I mean, the whole core value, or the beating heart of the foundation, is the commitment of all the people here to the philosophy that the highest calling in life, or highest purpose in life, is helping other people.
Absolutely.
So this, for everybody who works here, it really is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to potentially help millions of people. I used to have the best job in the world as being the co-chair of neurosurgery with a large international practice where I got to challenge the most daunting diseases afflicting mankind hand to hand, toe to toe, and had a research laboratory with, a huge number of people creating a large body of knowledge. And we were able to train the whole future generation of neurosurgeons. That was the best job in the world. It was totally, totally fun. And in my clinical practice, I would affect several hundred patients per year, 300 plus or minus. And I say affect because sometimes things didn't work out real well. In the research that I'd been doing, it would affect thousands, 10,000 plus or minus 1,000 per year. Focused ultrasound affects millions of patients per year. So to make the transition from having this fabulous job to running this foundation was basically a moral imperative. And the work is much harder than it was in neurosurgery because it's all information, and it's 24/7 because it's global. And people say, well, aren't you proud of the successes? And I say, not really, because my major sensation is one of frustration, because when we first started, everything was on the come, right? It was all vapor. None of it was real. But now we've had some real successes, and we see more successes that are just on the horizon, not over the horizon. And the fact that we see so many people that we know in a couple of years we'd be able to help, but we can't right now. So that's the bad news, is we don't have cures for all the diseases we would like to have cures for. The good news is that even though we don't have cures, we're able to provide hope to people that didn't have any hope in the past.
Well, thanks to your passion and your commitment to the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, those days will get here sooner, I'm sure. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Kassell.
My pleasure.
This episode of Curing with Sound has been presented by the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. If you would like to learn more about Focused Ultrasound or the Foundation, visit our website at fussfoundation.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media.